The last thing my daughter ever asked me for was not money, medicine, or a miracle. She simply looked up at me from that hospital bed and whispered, "Dad, are Grandma and Grandpa coming?" I lied to her. I told her they were busy. I told her they loved her. I told her everything would be okay. She was 8 years old, terrified, and fighting for her life. I couldn't bring myself to tell a dying child that the people who had taught me what family meant had decided that saving her was too expensive. My name is Orrin Vale, and for most of my life, I believed there was a difference between being poor and being abandoned. I learned otherwise when my daughter was dying. Her name was Elowen. She had a laugh that always started quietly, as if she were trying not to disturb anyone, and then somehow filled the entire room. She collected strange little things, buttons, polished stones, old coins, broken bits of jewelry, and kept them in a blue wooden box beneath her bed. Whenever I asked why she saved things nobody else wanted, she'd shrug. Because somebody should. That was Elowen. She could find value in almost anything. When she was 8, doctors discovered a rare condition affecting her heart. At first, we thought the diagnosis would be something we could fight with time. It wasn't. The first specialist told us treatment would be difficult. The second specialist told us it would be expensive. The third specialist studied the scans for several minutes before finally looking at me and my wife. There is a procedure we can try. It isn't guaranteed, but if we can get her into treatment quickly, it gives her a real chance. A chance. That was the word she used. Not a promise, not a miracle. A chance. The problem was that the procedure had to be paid for in stages, and the next payment was far beyond what we could afford. I had savings, but nowhere near enough. I owned a small architectural drafting firm in Bellwether, a city where old factories had been converted into apartments and every second building seemed to be under construction. I worked constantly. My wife, Mariah, worked as a school counselor. We weren't rich, but we weren't careless either. We paid our bills, we saved when we could. We had built a normal life. Then our daughter became sick, and suddenly normal didn't matter anymore. I called my parents that night. My father, Halden, answered. "Dad," I said, "I need your help." There was silence. Then he asked one question. "How much?" I told him. He exhaled slowly. "Orrin, we don't have that kind of money." I closed my eyes. "You have retirement savings. That money is tied up. You have the lake property. It isn't worth what you think. You told me last year you were selling it." That fell through. I swallowed. "Dad, she's your granddaughter." "I know who she is." His voice hardened. "We can't destroy our future because you didn't prepare for yours." That sentence changed something inside me, but I wasn't ready to admit it. I called my mother, Vespera, hoping she would be different. She wasn't. She cried. She said she loved Elowen. She said she prayed every night. Then she said something that made my stomach turn. "We have to be realistic, Orrin. Sometimes people have to accept what life gives them." I stared at the hospital ceiling after the call ended. I didn't tell Mariah exactly what my mother had said. I couldn't. Instead, I sold my car. Then I sold my apartment. Then nearly everything in my office that wasn't nailed down. Friends contributed. Mariah borrowed money from her sister. We raised enough to get Elowen through the first stage of treatment. But the full procedure required another payment, and the hospital wouldn't schedule the next stage until we could prove we had the funds. Every morning became a countdown. Every phone call became a potential answer. Every time a nurse entered the room, my heart jumped. Then, 3 days before Elowen was scheduled to be transferred to another hospital for the next stage of treatment, I received a message from my younger brother. Guess what? Mom and Dad are finally helping me with the house. I thought I had misunderstood him. I stared at the message, then typed, "What house?" He sent photographs. A massive, modern home overlooking the northern ridge, glass walls, stone terraces, a heated pool, a 3-car garage. The price was visible in the listing, $1.18 million. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. Then I called him. "What did you mean by Mom and Dad are helping?" Rhett laughed. "They're covering the down payment." My mouth went dry. "How much?" There was a brief pause. Then he answered casually, $280 grand. I couldn't breathe. My daughter needed money for a procedure that might keep her alive. My parents had just given my brother $280,000 for a house. I looked at Elowen sleeping in the hospital bed, then at the message on my phone, then back at my daughter. I didn't tell Mariah what I'd just learned. Not yet. I drove to my parents' house alone. My mother opened the door. The moment she saw my face, her expression changed. She looked surprised, then frightened. I walked past her. "Where's Dad?" "In the study." I found him standing beside a folder on his desk, a folder with a bank logo. I pointed at it. "What is that?" He didn't answer. I opened it. Inside was a transfer confirmation. $280,000, residential purchase deposit. Recipient, Reth Vale. Date, 6 days earlier. I looked at my father. "You told me you didn't have money." Silence. "You told me it was tied up." Nothing. "You told me I hadn't prepared for my daughter's future." His jaw tightened. Then my mother stepped between us. "Oren, please." "Please what?" Her eyes filled with tears. "We knew you would make this into something ugly." I laughed. It was the strangest sound I'd ever heard come out of my own mouth. "Ugly?" I held up the transfer. "My daughter is fighting for her life. We know. And you gave him nearly $300,000? He needed a home." I stared at her. "He needed a house." She nodded. "Yes." I looked toward my father. "And Elowen needs a heart." My mother looked away. My father said nothing. That silence told me more than any explanation could have. There was no misunderstanding, no hidden emergency, no sudden loss, no financial crisis I didn't know about. They had money. They simply hadn't wanted to spend it on my child. I put the paper back on the desk. Then I walked out. I didn't scream. I didn't threaten them. I didn't even ask why, because somewhere inside me, I already knew that no answer would make it hurt less. When I returned to the hospital, Elowen was awake. She smiled when I entered. "Daddy." I sat beside her. She reached for my hand. "Did Grandma call?" My throat tightened. "No." Her smile faded slightly. "Did you call her?" I forced myself to smile. "Yeah." "Is she coming?" I forced myself to smile. "She's busy." Elowen looked at me for a moment. Then she squeezed my fingers. "Are you sad?" "Just tired." She glanced at the chair beside the bed. "Then sit down." I sat. She leaned against my arm. After a moment, she whispered, "When I get better, can we go back to the lake?" The question nearly destroyed me. "The lake?" She nodded. "I want to find another blue stone." I swallowed hard. "Yeah, sweetheart." "You promise?" I looked at my daughter. "I promise." She smiled. Then she closed her eyes. 8 years old, still making plans for a future she had no idea might be slipping away. That night, the doctor came into our room. She didn't sit down. That was how I knew something was wrong. "We've had a complication," she said. Mariah immediately stood. "What happened?" The doctor explained that Elowen's condition had worsened and that her heart was no longer responding as well as they had hoped. The next stage of treatment couldn't wait much longer. "We need the hospital payment confirmed immediately," she said. "If we miss this window, the procedure may no longer be safe enough to attempt." I looked at Maria. She looked at me. Neither of us spoke. We had already sold almost everything we could. We had borrowed from everyone willing to help, and there was still not enough. For the first time since this nightmare began, I realized we had reached the one thing I couldn't sell: time. Elowen's fingers slipped from mine as the monitor suddenly screamed. Doctors rushed into the room. Maria cried her name. I stood frozen against the wall as the room filled with movement. Then my phone vibrated. I looked down. A message from Rhett. Another photograph. He was standing in front of his new house, smiling beneath the lights of the entrance. Underneath it, he'd written, "Mom and Dad made this possible. Couldn't have done it without them." I looked from the photograph to my daughter's hospital bed, and something inside me went completely still. For years, I had believed the worst thing my parents could do was refuse to help me. I was wrong. The worst thing was realizing that they had been willing to watch my daughter lose her chance while using their money to build my brother a life he didn't need. They had already chosen what mattered more to them: money, security, appearances, and now I finally understood something worse than losing my parents. They had already chosen to lose me. They just hadn't realized yet that I was going to make sure the truth caught up with them. And when it did, they were going to regret the choice they had made. Elowen died at 4:17 in the morning. There was no dramatic final speech, no miracle, no last-minute recovery, just a soft electronic tone, followed by a silence so complete that I could hear the rain striking the hospital window. Maria was holding our daughter's hand. I was standing on the other side of the bed. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then Maria whispered, "She's gone." I looked at Elowen. Her face was peaceful, almost as if she had finally fallen asleep. I wanted to scream. Instead, I leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Not because I hadn't loved her enough, not because I hadn't fought for her, but because I couldn't protect her from the people who were supposed to love her too. I kept thinking about the promise I had made earlier that night, the lake, the blue stone, the future she had still been planning. I had promised her we'd go. She never got the chance. The funeral was 5 days later. My parents came. That surprised me. My mother cried beside the coffin. My father shook hands with people and accepted condolences with the sullen expression of a grieving grandfather. And Rhett arrived in a black suit that probably cost more than my first car. He stood beside my parents as if we were still one family, as if nothing had happened, as if Elowen's empty bedroom wasn't waiting for us at home. When everyone left, I remained beside her grave. The cemetery was almost empty. I was staring at the flowers when I heard footsteps behind me. My father. "Oren." I didn't turn. "We're grieving too." I stared at the headstone. "Then grieve somewhere else." He sighed. "You can't blame us for what happened." That finally made me look at him. "I don't blame you for her illness." He swallowed. "I blame you for telling me you couldn't help when you could." His face hardened. "You don't know our financial situation. I saw the transfer. You don't understand the circumstances. Then explain them." He opened his mouth. For a moment, I thought he might finally tell me the truth. Instead, he looked at Elowen's grave. "We did what we thought was right." I felt something cold settle inside me. "No," I said. "You did what you wanted." He didn't answer. He simply walked away. That was the last conversation we had for nearly 7 years. I cut them out completely. No calls, no birthdays, no Christmas cards, no explanations. I changed my number. I moved. I closed my old drafting firm and started a new company under my middle name so distant relatives couldn't easily find me. Maria and I eventually separated, not because we stopped loving each other, because grief had turned us into two people who kept reopening the same wound simply by looking at each other. Some nights she blamed herself. Other nights I blamed myself. Neither of us had actually caused what happened, but grief doesn't care about fairness. She moved west. I stayed, and I rebuilt myself from the pieces nobody saw. I worked. I saved. I bought failing properties, repaired them, and sold them. Then I stopped selling. I began restoring abandoned buildings and turning them into affordable housing. There was something strangely comforting about fixing places other people had decided were worthless. Maybe because I understood the feeling. By the time I was 37, I had built a company with more than 100 employees. I owned several buildings. I had money, real money. But I never bought a house like Rhett's. I lived in a renovated brick townhouse with one bedroom I never used. Elowin's blue wooden box sat on a shelf inside it. I never opened it, not for years. I was afraid that if I did, everything I'd spent years burying would come rushing back. Then, 7 years after the funeral, I received an envelope. No return address. Inside was a photocopy of a bank document. I recognized the name immediately. My father's. But this wasn't the transfer for Rhett's house. It was older, much older. The document showed that my parents had moved $410,000 into a separate investment account 3 weeks before I had asked them for help. The money hadn't been tied up. It hadn't been inaccessible. They had moved it deliberately. I read the document twice, then a third time, and that's when I noticed the account wasn't in my parents' names. It was held by a family trust. The beneficiary was Rhett Vale. I stared at the page. The trust had been created 4 years before Elowin was born. That didn't make sense. Why would my parents have created a trust for Rhett years before he bought a house? I looked at the document again. There were additional transactions, small at first, then larger. The pattern continued for years. Money was moving between my parents' accounts, the trust, and several companies I didn't recognize. I needed someone who understood financial records better than I did, so I hired an investigator. Her name was Sable Kestrel. I gave her one instruction: find out where their money went. 3 weeks later, she asked me to meet her in a quiet cafe. She placed a thick folder on the table. I found something. I opened it. The first pages were ordinary financial records. Then I reached a property deed. My parents had owned a parcel of land outside Bellwether. They had sold it for nearly $2 million. But the money hadn't gone into their retirement. It hadn't gone into Rhett's house either. Sable tapped a page farther down. They transferred part of it through a company that didn't exist under their family name. I looked at her. Why? I'm not sure yet. She turned another page, but I found where some of it ended up. I read the name. Elowin Vale Children's Foundation. My heart stopped. What is this? Sable leaned back. Your parents created it after your daughter died. I couldn't speak. What does it do? Almost nothing. She pushed another document toward me. It has no staff, no regular public programs, no meaningful fundraising. I looked at the account statements, but there are deposits. Large ones. I stared at the numbers. Thousands. Then tens of thousands. Then hundreds of thousands. My parents had spent years putting money into a foundation bearing my daughter's name, money they had refused to give her while she was alive. I felt sick. Why? Sable hesitated. That was my question. She opened another file. Then I found this. It was a photograph of a large stone sign, the Elowin Vale Memorial Center. My daughter's name was carved across the front. I stared at it. When was this built? Construction began 18 months ago. I looked at her. Why didn't I hear about it? Because it was announced locally. Your parents never contacted you. I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. Of course they hadn't. They hadn't wanted their son at their granddaughter's funeral, but they wanted her name on a building. Sable continued. There's something else. She slid a document toward me. The foundation owns the memorial center. I frowned. And the money in the foundation came from companies connected to your parents. I looked back at her. So they donated money to themselves? That's what the records suggest. My stomach turned. Sable pointed to another page. The foundation is describing the money publicly as charitable funding. I understood. They weren't simply remembering Elowen. They were using her name to create the appearance of generosity. My daughter had become a reputation, a photograph, a stone building, a story they could tell strangers. I closed the folder. They're using her. Sable nodded. There is one more problem. She pulled out a copy of a foundation document. The foundation has a clause giving control over its charitable distributions to designated family trustees. I read the names. My father's name was first. My mother's was second. Rhett's was listed as an alternate. I looked up. So my father controls the money. Yes, and the foundation bearing my daughter's name exists largely on money moving through companies connected to my parents. Yes. I leaned back. For a moment, I couldn't hear anything around me. Then I thought about Elowen asking me whether Grandma was coming. I thought about my mother telling me to accept what life gave me, and I understood what they'd done. They had refused to help when helping mattered. Then, after she was gone, they had discovered that her name was useful. I closed the folder. I want everything. Sable nodded. How far? Until there's nothing left to find. The next morning, she called me. There's another development. We met at her office. She placed a photograph in front of me. It showed my parents standing beside the memorial center. My father was shaking hands with a local politician. My mother was smiling for the cameras. And behind them stood Rhett. But Rhett wasn't smiling. He was staring at the camera with an expression I couldn't understand. Fear. Maybe anger. Maybe both. I turned the photograph over. On the back, Sable had written, "The public story is only half of it." I looked at her. What does that mean? I found documents connecting the land purchase, the memorial project, and Rhett's house. My chest tightened. How? Your parents used the same family trust in all three transactions. I stared at the photograph again. The house, the trust, the memorial, my daughter's name, my brother, my parents. Suddenly, they didn't look like separate events anymore. They looked like pieces of the same plan. That night, for the first time in 7 years, I searched for Rhett's number. I still had it. I had never deleted it. I'd simply never called. My thumb hovered over the screen for several seconds. Then I pressed the button. He answered on the 4th ring. Neither of us spoke. Finally, Rhett whispered, "Is it really you?" "Yes." His breathing changed. "Oren, I need to tell you something before Mom and Dad find out I contacted you." I sat down. "What?" His voice cracked. "The house they bought me wasn't a gift." I stared at the wall. "What do you mean?" "They made me sign something." "What?" "A private debt agreement." My stomach tightened. "Why?" "Because the money wasn't really mine." I closed my eyes. "How much do you owe?" There was a long silence. Then he told me. The number was far larger than the $280,000 down payment. I opened my eyes. "What did they make you agree to?" Rhett's voice dropped to a whisper. "If I stop cooperating with them, I lose the house." I said nothing. "And Oren?" "What?" "They told me you would never come back." My jaw tightened. "Why?" Because they were afraid you'd find out what the memorial is really for. The room suddenly felt colder. What is it for? Rhett took a shaky breath. I don't know everything. Then tell me what you do know. He was silent for several seconds. Then he said, They're using Eloan's name to get access to something worth far more than that house. I stared into the darkness. And for the first time since my daughter died, I realized the betrayal wasn't simply about the money they had refused to give her. The house, the trust, the memorial, the foundation. They were connected, and somehow my brother had been trapped inside the same machine that had destroyed our family. Now I had only one question left. What exactly were my parents trying to buy with my daughter's name? Rhett didn't tell me everything over the phone. He asked me to meet him somewhere neither of us had ever been before, an abandoned train station on the eastern edge of Bellwether. When I arrived, he was standing beneath a broken clock with both hands shoved into his coat pockets. He looked older than 35, not older in years, older in the way fear ages a person. What did they make you sign? I asked. He pulled a folded document from his coat. I thought it was standard. I opened it. It wasn't. The $280,000 my parents had used for the house had been structured as a private family loan tied to the same trust Sable had discovered. Rhett was listed as the borrower, my parents' trust was the lender. The house was collateral. And there was another clause buried near the bottom. If Red failed to make the required payments, the trust could take control of the property. I looked at him. You signed this? I thought it was standard. You didn't read it? I trusted Dad. He gave a bitter laugh. That was my mistake. I turned to another page. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The same trust connected to Rhett's house also held ownership interests in several properties around Bellwether. One of those properties was the land beneath the Eloan Vale Memorial Center. I looked up. What does this have to do with Eloan? Red looked away. Everything. He told me what he'd discovered. After Eloan died, our parents had quietly begun buying properties in a declining neighborhood on the edge of Bellwether. At first, Rhett thought they were simply investing. Then, the Memorial Center was announced. Publicly, it was presented as a place where families could find support and where donations could help children facing serious medical problems. But privately, my parents were using the memorial's charitable image to make the surrounding redevelopment project easier to approve. The memorial made them look compassionate. The redevelopment made them money, and my daughter's name connected the two. I stared at the document. They used her. Rhett nodded. They used everyone. I looked at him. Why tell me now? He swallowed. Because I finally realized what happens if I stay quiet. What? I lose everything. For years, I'd imagined this moment. I'd imagined Rhett apologizing. I'd imagined telling him exactly what I thought of him. Instead, I felt almost nothing. That isn't my problem. He flinched. I know. He handed me another document. This is why I'm really here. It was a notice from the lender. Rhett had fallen behind on his business obligations, and because the family loan was tied to the house, my parents' trust had begun the process of taking control of the property. The deadline was approaching. They're going to take the house, he said. I looked at him. And your business? If they take the house, they can force me to sell my remaining ownership interest in the company to cover the rest. I almost laughed. Your parents built you a trap. He looked down. Yeah. There was a long silence. Then I asked, why didn't you tell me before? His eyes filled. Because I was ashamed. I said nothing. They told me you hated me. My jaw tightened. They told me you blamed me for Eloan. I looked away, and I believed them. That sentence hit harder than I expected, because suddenly I remembered something I'd almost forgotten. When Elowyn was alive, Rhett had been the uncle who brought her ridiculous souvenirs from his business trips. A tiny wooden bird from one city, a silver button from another. Elowyn had once told me that Uncle Rhett was good at finding treasure. Then everything changed. Not because either of us had chosen it, because our parents had filled the silence between us with lies. I folded the documents. "I won't save your house." Rhett nodded slowly. "I understand. But I will make sure your parents can't use it to control you." He looked up. "How?" "I'll buy the debt from the trust." His expression changed. "You can do that?" "If the agreement allows the note to be transferred, yes." "Why?" I looked directly at him. "Because Elowyn shouldn't be the reason they own you." He stared at me. "What do you want in return?" "The truth." His face tightened. "To who?" "To everyone." He nodded. "I'll do it. Not just at the memorial." He looked confused. "You'll give Sable everything." He hesitated. "Everything?" "Everything." He slowly nodded. "For once," he said, "I will." 3 weeks later, the Memorial Center's grand opening arrived. Hundreds of people attended. Local officials, developers, charity representatives, reporters, community leaders. My parents stood beneath a massive photograph of Elowyn. I watched from the back. Nobody recognized me. The photograph bothered me immediately. It wasn't one of the pictures I'd taken. It showed Elowyn sitting at the lake, holding a blue stone in both hands. She was smiling. My parents had enlarged the photograph until her face was almost the size of a doorway, and underneath it was a sentence: "Every child deserves a chance." I nearly walked out. Then my mother stepped toward the microphone. She talked about compassion. She talked about family. She talked about how Elowyn's death had inspired them to help other children. I listened until I couldn't stand it anymore. Then I walked forward. The crowd slowly parted. My mother stopped speaking, her face drained of color. "Oren?" The microphone amplified the single word. Everyone turned. I stepped toward the stage. "I have a question." My father moved toward me. "Not here." I held up my hand. "No." The room became silent. I looked at the photograph behind them. "That is my daughter." My mother began crying. "I know." "You didn't help her when she was alive." Her lips trembled. "Oren, please." "You told me you didn't have the money." My father reached for the microphone. "This isn't the place." I looked toward the audience. "Then where is?" I handed the first document to a reporter standing near the stage. The bank transfer, then the trust records, then the property documents, then the foundation records. Nobody needed to understand every page. They only needed to see the pattern. Money had moved from my parents' companies into the foundation. The foundation had funded the memorial. The memorial had been built on land connected to the same network of properties, and the same family trust had been used to finance Rhett's house. The story they'd told the public was beginning to fall apart. My father stepped toward me. "You have no idea what you're talking about." I looked at him. "Then explain it." He couldn't. Not without explaining the transfer, not without explaining the trust, not without explaining why a foundation named after a dead child had become financially connected to companies controlled by her grandparents. Then Rhett walked onto the stage. My father stared at him. "What are you doing?" Rhett took the microphone. His hands were shaking, but his voice wasn't. "For once," he said, "I'm telling the truth." My mother's face collapsed. Rhett explained everything: the house, the private loan, the trust, the pressure, the redevelopment plans, the foundation, and the lies our parents had told both of us. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't call them criminals.
He simply told the truth. That made it worse. The room became increasingly silent as he explained that money presented publicly as charitable support had moved through companies connected to our parents before reaching the foundation. They hadn't simply donated their wealth. They had moved money between entities they controlled while using Elowen's name to make the project appear more charitable than it really was.
My father shouted that everything was legal. I believed him. That was the worst part. Some of it probably was legal, but legal wasn't the same as moral, and it wasn't the same as honest. A reporter asked my mother why she had refused to help Elowen when the family had access to hundreds of thousands of dollars. She couldn't answer. Another reporter asked why the foundation's financial records were so closely connected to family-owned companies. My father tried to leave. The cameras followed him. Nobody needed me to destroy my parents. They were finally being forced to explain themselves. I stepped away from the microphone. And before I left, I looked once more at Elowen's photograph. For a second, I imagined her standing beside me, 8 years old, holding one of her blue stones, probably wondering why all the adults were arguing. I whispered under my breath, "I remember you." Then I walked out. I didn't stay to watch the reporters surround my parents. I didn't need to. The truth had already done what revenge never could. It had made them answer questions they had spent years avoiding. In the months that followed, the memorial project was suspended while regulators and financial investigators reviewed its records. Some of the redevelopment plans were canceled. The foundation was placed under independent oversight. My parents lost control of the charitable organization they had created. Their reputation suffered, their business interests suffered. But I didn't spend my days watching them fall. I had spent enough of my life looking backward. As for Rhett, the debt was transferred to me. I canceled it. I also helped him restructure his business so he could keep his company without using the house as collateral.
He tried to thank me. I refused. "I didn't do it because you're my brother." He looked at me. "Then why?" "Because nobody gets to own you again." His eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve that." "Maybe not." I paused. "But Elowen deserved better than what all of us gave her." He nodded. "We never became the brothers we had been before. Some things can't be repaired simply because the truth finally comes out. But we stopped being enemies. That was enough. As for my parents, I never saw them after the memorial. My mother wrote letters, dozens of them. I returned every one unopened. My father sent legal documents. I gave them to my attorney. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted distance. Years passed. Then, one morning, a package arrived. There was no return address. Inside was Elowen's blue wooden box. I hadn't known my mother still had it. My hands started shaking before I even opened it. There was a note, just 3 words. She deserved better. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Then I opened the box. Inside were the little things Elowen had collected. Buttons, stones, broken jewelry. A tiny wooden bird Rhett had once brought her from a business trip. And one photograph I had never seen. It showed Elowen sitting between my parents at Christmas. She was smiling. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, were the words, "Our little girl." I stared at those words for a long time.
For years, I had wondered whether my parents had ever loved her. Now I knew the answer. They had. And somehow that made what they did even harder to understand. Because people don't always hurt us because they don't care. Sometimes they hurt us because they care about something else more. Money, status, fear, control, family image. Whatever it is, it becomes the thing they protect. And when that happens, love becomes an excuse instead of a choice. I never forgave my parents. Not because I wanted them to suffer, not because I wanted them to feel what I felt, but because forgiveness was never something they could demand from me. They had a lifetime of opportunities to choose differently. They chose themselves, so I chose myself, and I chose Elowen. I kept her blue box on the shelf beside my desk, not as a monument to what I lost, as a reminder of what I refused to become. And I finally opened it regularly. Sometimes I would hold one of her stones. Sometimes I would read an old note she'd written. Sometimes I would simply sit there and remember the sound of her laugh. I didn't want my daughter to become a tragedy I only remembered with pain. She had been a child before she had been a patient. She had loved blue stones. She had collected broken things. She had asked to go back to the lake. She believed people could be kind. I wanted to remember all of that. So I built something in her name. Not another memorial building, not a place where politicians could stand beneath her photograph.
A scholarship fund for families facing children's medical treatment they couldn't afford. No photograph of me, no family speeches, no plaques with my name, just help, real help. And every year I personally signed the final approvals, because somewhere in another hospital there might be another father standing beside another bed, hearing the same words I once heard. We can treat her, but you need the money. I wanted those parents to hear a different answer. Yes. Years after everything ended, I received one final message from Rhett. It contained a photograph. His daughter, my niece, was holding a little blue wooden box. He had named her Ilara. Under the photograph, he wrote, "I told her about Iloan." I stared at the screen. Then I put the phone down. I didn't cry. For the first time, remembering my daughter didn't feel like falling. It felt like standing. My parents lost much of the fortune and control they had spent years protecting. Rhett lost the life they had designed for him, and I lost the only person I could never get back. But in the end, my revenge wasn't destroying them. It was refusing to let what happened to Iloan become meaningless.
Their worst decision became the reason other families received help. Their attempt to use her name became the beginning of something they could never control. They chose money over my daughter. I chose her memory over everything they had. And that was the one choice they could never take away from me. If you were in my position, would you have exposed the truth publicly, or would you have walked away and never looked back? Tell me in the comments. And if this story reminded you of someone who chose money, pride, or appearances over family, share this with them. Because sometimes the strongest revenge isn't making someone hurt the way you hurt. Sometimes it's building a life so meaningful that the people who betrayed you no longer have any place in it.